very much. So first I should get my breathing right, because I've actually stolen Matt's suggestion as to how I could communicate my content. He advertised his talk essentially with that sort of color and font, and I thought I should probably just do the same. So last year I've seen that, like, everyone who is important has a safe harbor statement. That is mine. But the picture is probably a little bit closer to James last night, as we were sat next to a toilet door. So I would like to talk a little bit about the consumer IoT and difficulties that I see bringing together the technology and humans. So in 20 years, when we have between 30 and 50 billion connected devices in our living rooms, we're all going to have health management systems, smart heating, air conditioning, room occupancy, etc., etc. All these systems will talk to each other, and we're going to live a happy life. It's not quite the case yet, because at least like my smart home at the moment happens mostly in the form of like separated apps, and I need to make all the decisions myself, and I'm usually confronted with a dashboard and then need to sort it out. And I don't really think that just adding more sensors into your house makes it a smart home. There's something that's lacking. So I think we have a desire to have these intelligent things that probably talk to us. Now, we don't want to have just a lot of blah, blah, blah. So in this cartoon, essentially the man says, like, can the Internet of Things not finally shut up? Because everything has a vocal message for him, including, like, this patient is incontinent. And that's just the sort of stuff you don't want to hear. So when I looked around for people's visions at how we could probably leverage all of these connected devices, I came across this blog post from OpenBox. And essentially, they picture this scenario that you're waking up in a hotel room and a soft computer voice tells you, well, I'm sorry to wake you up, and the blinds are opening automatically. And it says, well, I had to wake you earlier because there's a snowstorm coming, and I had to book you on an earlier flight as you're going to have an important meeting with someone else. And you need to get up now because I've already booked a taxi to get you to the airport. And I think this is really how many of us probably imagine the bright future of IoT and of consumer products, and how this could all come together. So what needs to happen there in the background is essentially a machine that can take all of these entities, current time, a calendar, so a schedule, knowledge of the things that can be controlled in a particular building environment, for example. And the machine needs to prioritize, needs to essentially understand what it means that there is something that depends on time, and that you need to leave to an airport in order to take a flight. You cannot just assume that you're there instantly, etc. So it must do all the planning, and then it must provision. So here in that case, it would be building control. It would have legal capacity in order, for example, to book you on another flight, because there's finance involved. So we will have to trust machines with our finances, right? And then in that case, it also takes care of mobility, orders a taxi for you, etc. And I've already half-jokingly tweeted that Dave effectively summarized my slides 4 to 28. So we have action going on all around us. It's raw data. That raw data needs to be condensed to information. And you may probably remember, those of you who came to ThingMonk last year, you can give raw data structure by the use of ontologies, for example. I spoke about that. So here in that case, we would infer, for example, from the coordinates that we are in an airport hotel. from the schedule that we need to travel, etc., etc. And then there's this knowledge and actionable insight layer, and that is something that Nick spoke about. And I think when we talk about the conversational IoT, what we actually mean is that things talk to each other and can dynamically really start to make sense of the changing environment. So there are smart people writing about IoT, and one of them is David Rose. And he has this vision of enchanted objects. So we're going to have things that enable us to do magic, like, you know, the umbrella that lights up if rain is predicted. So it's sort of like the ability to look into the future, that sort of thing. Now, we should say enchantment has a solid scientific foundation in that case. There is no magic involved in enchanted objects. So acquiring knowledge, usually for us, is learning. So what machines need to do is machine learning, but we should not mistake machine learning for creative thinking. It is really just decision making with the laws of statistics and the application of algorithms. So there are various ways how machines can make sense of knowledge and how they can make decisions. Sometimes it's just simple rules. Sometimes it's very simple statistics. Or then there are a couple of other machine learning methods that allow you to classify certain things. And all of this needs to happen somewhere in the back layer of your software. Now there's one problem. In the world of machine learning, there's no absolute truth out there, okay? So we're taking an awful lot of raw data, and these are hard facts, and they are intuitive when you look at them. It's just that they will overwhelm you once they are of a certain amount. So we need to go from data to probabilities. So the computer makes predictions on the basis of our data. But just as with the weather forecast, which at the end of the day is nothing like a machine learning exercise, it's just a likelihood that tomorrow the weather is going to be good or bad, right? There is no absolute guarantee for that. Now, most of us have a sense for simple probabilities. So, for example, when we are driving along a straight, and our average speed is of a certain of a certain speed, we can sort of predict how long it's going to take us to arrive at our destination. But actually, if you go, for example, at that speed, there's a spread of values how long it could take you to get to your destination. And we just assume that it's going to be a relatively stable motion without any interruptions, etc., etc. But again, if we see on the M25 20 minutes to this exit, essentially we're being given the probability that we're going to arrive there in 20 minutes. And we can sort of deal with that information. Now, when we go into more complex decision making, for example, is our flight going to be delayed, or is there a chance of our flight being delayed? What would happen is that we take all of this information into account: the temperature, wind speed, wind direction, precipitation, probably what airline it is. They may have different policies, what aircraft. And there's all sorts of other stuff, like, for example, is the flight fully booked? What's the average delay rate for this company? Do they serve booze? Like, you know, including irrelevant information. Then, well, that's for you, yeah. Not for the problem. So, my white box, which is actually a black box, then takes in training data. So essentially, we're going to learn the sort of metrics that allow us to decide when it's more likely that a flight's going to happen and when the flight's going to be cancelled, okay? So that thing decides essentially which features, all of those here, and serving boost is probably not one of them, are relevant for our problem, what weight these features have, what thresholds these features have, and we're going to get some sort of performance metric. Now, we can feed in new data, and on the basis of how we've trained our classifier, we can then make that prediction whether the flight's going to happen or not. So what you essentially then get is a hypothesis. And you can test this hypothesis computationally by comparing it to your training data. So here in that case, we would say we take the 50 flights, and then we decide whether we predicted the cancellation correctly. And then you can plot essentially your true positives versus 1 minus the specificity, so the false positives. If you are above this diagonal, then you have a somewhat good predictor. If you are below the diagonal, essentially your machine learning exercise has been absolutely futile because you're worse than making a random decision. But this is the sort of thing that needs to happen in software to distill all of this information together and give the consumer information and probably advice to make a decision. And I don't know yet how something like this could be easily communicated. It touches very much upon these conceptual models, or it's an extension of the conceptual model that Claire was talking about this morning. So good decision making for humans as well as for machines is based on experience. And machine learning is largely an iterative process. So you do training, you get a classifier, you feed in your data, you do performance assessment. If it's good enough, well, we can get on with life. But typically, it's not good enough. We need to essentially feed it more training data, improve our classifier, and go over this process iteratively several times. And in fact, that's happening in real-life software. So, for example, I have a HelloSense, which is a sleep monitoring device. And it takes my movements overnight into account, as well as various conditions, for example, humidity in the room, temperature in the room, noise level, light level, etc., etc. And out of all of these information, it condenses a score, and it tells me cheerfully in the morning, we believe your sleep last night was worth, I don't know, 80 arbitrary units. Now, it's a problem with the product because they never explain you if 80 is actually good or bad and how this can be improved. But quite fortunately, they also ask you, how was your sleep last night? And over time, they seem to adjust the score. So in the beginning, they're probably under the impression that every night's a great night. And only over time, as you say, well, your assessment of my sleep last night was pretty shit, they seem to adjust that score. So this is really machine learning already happening. So there's an issue with missing data. So given all relevant features for a particular problem, machines can really detect causality and dependency between different variables. And there's this one example here that in the absence of any additional information, there seems to be a correlation between body height and salary, okay? Now, if you bring in that missing piece of information, namely gender, you totally break that dependency between body height and salary. You simply recognize that these are independent of each other, but just that females usually earn less than males. So it's important to find out what your missing information for a particular problem is. So self-learning systems and these assistants will have to seek the missing data. So here in that case, other than saying it's an urgent meeting in your calendar, how can the machine assess that when we're going to meet Kyle, it's really urgent? And one way to do this would be preemptively. And I'm just showing the Amazon Echo here. This is one of these devices that I could imagine would serve pretty well in filtering critical information out of the stream of noise that you're making all day long. Essentially, that language processing allows these systems to extract the relevant information. Now, whether or not you agree to that, that's a different matter. Now, these things can get even more creepy. So I went to bed. Me and my partner were moving around, and we were moving around a little more, and then I fell asleep. Now, if we look at the conversational internet, is there something you should tell me, Boris? I thought your wife was traveling. The machine needs to learn. The machine's not going to ask you once. It's going to ask you twice. It's going to ask you 3 times. Remember Clippy? This could be your life. So I think there's a risk. So life is becoming more and more dependent on probabilities and abstract quantities. So whilst back in the days, everyone looked at the bar chart and knew what was going on, we will get essentially predictions with p-values, false discovery rates, etc., associated with them. That is something that you need to essentially hide away from the average consumer. It's all right if you communicate that to an engineer, but it's not okay to really tell people, well, you know, with p 10 to the minus 7, this and that's going to happen. Because people just lack an understanding of these probabilities. So, and then adding to our anxiety of uncertainty, if we can't really tell what these values mean, the conversational IT may potentially feel repetitive, even disruptive or intrusive. And I've given you an example. And with that, I'm finished. And I'm quite looking forward to hear Matt talk about the conversational IoT.